Hello, my name is Tanya Domi, and I am Director of Media Relations at the Graduate Center CUNY. And I'm here today to interview Professor Stanley Renshon, one of our political science faculty members, about his new book, The Real Psychology of the Trump Presidency. He is also a trained psychoanalyst and has used these skills in his examination of 4 U.S. presidents, including George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald J. Trump, who is the subject of our interview today. So, Professor Renshon, as a political scientist and a psychoanalyst, you have developed an established record in profiling U.S. presidents from both disciplines. How do you approach a subject psychology, in this case, Donald Trump, from outside of traditional psychoanalysts? And secondly, what were your research strategies in writing up this book?
Well, thank you, Tanya, first of all, for having me. And as far as the research strategies, nothing fancy, nothing mysterious, really at its base, just basic social science. And what that means is gathering evidence from a wide variety of sources, beginning to develop categories of analysis within which to place and frame and evaluate them. Then you go on to form provisional theories, and then you test them against all the evidence you have and see how they hold up. Now, as you know, in Trump's case, this takes a lot of time and effort because there's enormous amount of Trump data. There's another factor as well, which is that he's probably the most misunderstood president in American history. And so in order to do any real kind of analysis that's helpful, you have to be willing and able to swim against the narrative tide of hyperbole and misinformation. And then, of course, for me, there's one further element, which is, I'm a psychoanalyst by training. And so that means I accept the basic model of Freud. And what's that? Well, it's the idea that there are patterns of behavior, that these patterns they develop and become consolidated over time, and that they can often change in response to circumstances. So you will see in my books, and this is true of the Trump book, it's true of all the other books I've written, I never use the word unconscious motivation. And I never talked about unconscious motivation, not because I don't believe it exists, I think it does for sure, but because at a distance, you really can't get to that. And it takes a lot of effort, even when you have somebody in your practice, to try to figure out what their unconscious motivation is. And one thing I certainly do not want to have my book rely on is the idea that I'm a psychoanalyst and you're not. I find that very arrogant and presumptuous. So what I do in this book, as I've done in all my other books, is I lay out the data that I have. The book is very heavily footnoted, and I show how I come to my observations and conclusions. And I do what I hope other people will do in their work too, which is leave it to the reader to sort through what they have in front of them and come to their own judgments. That's the best. That's what our purpose is as scholars.
So Trump has been accused as being quote unquote malignantly narcissistic. And you write that there is no doubt that narcissism is an important part of Trump's psychology. But you also write his critics have conflated Trump's branding strategy with his character, and that there is much more to him than his narcissism. What more would you say there is, and why do you think, given who he is, who he was in the past, why would he want to become president?
Well, those are really two good questions. Let me take the first one first. First of all, there's a lot of Trump psychology that gets mixed because people confuse the one element for the whole. Oh, he's narcissistic, and so that's the end of the story. I really don't have to just spend any more time analyzing what's going on. There's no doubt that he's narcissistic to some degree, but Analysts and people who are trained know that there's a difference between ordinary and pathological narcissism. And ordinary narcissism is what, all of us have to some degree. We all want to make our mark. We all want to do well. We all want to be recognized for the things we do. The difference between Trump and most people in the world, and that would include me, I'm sure, is that his ambitions are really enormous. I want to write a good book. I want my book to represent my work well and, have it be well received because a lot of effort has been put into. Trump wants to have ambition writ large. And so, one of the things about him is the level of his ambition, which has to do with the second question you asked me. And I think back to my early research on Trump and the fact that, as an adolescent in Queens, which is, across the bay from New York, he looked across the water and he saw the New York skyline. And he said to himself, I want to change that skyline. I want that skyline to, represent my work and my footprint. And, he wound up doing that. And it's an old story. His father was against it and told him to stay on Avenue Z in Queens. He'd make money, things would be fine. And Trump, Donald didn't want to do that. He wanted to make his own mark. So he went to New York. He got involved in, building, and he made his mark. And he wanted to, really change New York architecture, and he did to some degree. And then he built projects all over the country and the world. So his ambition is incredibly high, even for presidents. I think he and President Obama share a high level of ambition. Presidents like Carter, like Clinton, they have lower levels of ambitions for presidents. So even for presidents, there are different gradations of ambition. And I would put Trump and Obama, FDR, at the top of that list. And so that's one thing about his ambition that needs to be understood. And then, of course, there's the question of authenticity versus narrative. And of course, we don't think in terms of theories these days. We think in terms of narratives. Oh, this narrative is, the one that's the dominant narrative, and no, this narrative is being challenged. And we don't talk about theories because narratives are not theories. They're groups of facts, in quotes, that are assembled for a purpose. And the purpose is to present the narrative as the dominant way to think about things and to get people to think that they've discovered a theory when all they've discovered is somebody else's idea of what they ought to be thinking. So Trump is a very interesting guy in that way. There was a headline in the New York Times just the other day, which caught my eye. And the essential headline was that, because of Trump's health scare, that his advisors, so to speak, had said, well, this is a way that we can reset the narrative. You'll be a kinder, gentler Trump. And the bottom, the underneath part of the headline said, but Trump didn't follow the script. He didn't follow the narrative. And of course, that's precisely a psychological point about Trump that is exactly right. He doesn't follow the narrative. And sometimes that's a weakness and gets him into trouble. And sometimes that's an enormous strength because lots of people find themselves boxed in their own thinking because they can't take a step back from their assumptions. And Trump is a guy who's able and has been able to do that. And that, if you'll allow me, is one more item about what's different about Trump that people miss when they talk about, Trump is a narcissist and then they don't have to worry about it anymore. Trump is a very innovative guy. He's not a deep thinker. He's no Einstein. He won't be writing a book about the metaphysics of philosophy. You won't see that on your bookshelf ever. But he is the kind of guy who's able to look at a set of circumstances and see opportunities there and has the capacity to act on them. And that's a fairly unique set of categories. Notice there are two things there. He sees what he sees, and he also is able to act on them. A lot of people see what they can't act on because they're inhibited in one way or the other. There's one thing we can say about Trump, he's certainly not inhibited. So that's another strength and also another part of the panoply of weaknesses that he has, but they're part and parcel of understanding Trump's psychology. And I guess to get back to my original point, if you start with the assumption that Trump's a malignant narcissist, whatever the heck that term is supposed to mean, and you figure out that you don't have to, do any more examination, you start with your conclusions and end there, that's not analysis. That's not social science. That's not very helpful in figuring out who this guy is.